all, thank you everybody for coming tonight. My name's Gerardo. I am the CEO of Avocado Consulting. For those of you that don't know me, you may have seen that we've recently done an acquisition of Cyber Risk Australia to enhance our cyber capabilities. And one of the things we wanted to do as a consequence of that is put a night on like tonight, where we get to meet some people in this space, but also showcase to you guys who our partners and our capability and what our capabilities are. So thank you for coming tonight. You would have seen that Australia has certainly raised its profile on the global playing field as potentially a soft touch when it comes to ransomware and when it comes to cyber attacks. I think everybody in the room would have seen that. And we're playing with fixed budgets, and we've got fixed number of resources working in those cyber teams. So what we wanted to look at tonight is not so much those tier one guys that may have buckets of money and big, large teams, but if you're more of a mid-tier and working with a fixed budget and a fixed group of people, how do you keep your nose above water? How do you get past that minimum viable posture? How do we get from being in pain to going to a pane of glass? How do we get visibility of that customer experience, of our infrastructure, of our applications, of our crown jewels? How do we do that, given those constraints? We jokingly say that there are two kinds of companies, those that have been breached and those that don't know they've been breached. And if you accept that joke, should we really be doing cybersecurity, or should we maybe all go into media training and deal with the consequences of being breached? Somebody said to me, oh, it's all just hype. It's like Y2K, you know, people are just overhyping it. I'm sure the people that, I won't name their names, but in the last 3 or 4 that have happened would tend to disagree with you. The obvious answer to that is no. It is about security, because if we look to America, who's a bit further down the track than we are, and you look at the lawsuits and those kind of things that have been successful in that space, they've been against the companies that have been lazy or reckless or haven't taken cyber seriously. And those are the class actions and those are the lawsuits that have been successful. The ones where the company has done everything they can and still was breached, they haven't been successful. So as part of organisations that are facing that challenge, it's something to certainly keep in mind. So it's easy to say, well, let's go for more. And one of the arguments that we've been hearing is boards throwing back, you know, ROI at us. You know, what's my return on investment? And what I've been saying to people is throw it back at them. What is the ROI? What is the risk of inaction? What is the risk to our brand of doing nothing? What is the risk of sitting back and waiting to be breached? So ROI at me, ROI back at you. The challenge, though, as we understand it, is really the volume of data. The analogy that I keep seeing and that I like is, you know, the volume of data and messages flowing at us on a daily basis is like trying to drink from a fire hose. It's just impossible. So without some capability to filter that and to triage that noise, how are we ever going to be effective? And the best analogy I've heard of this was it took them 7 years to triage the data about the ozone layer to then find the ozone hole, that there was a hole there. 7 years. Imagine if it took 7 years to triage the number of cyber alerts that we're getting. 7 months, 7 weeks, 7 days, 7 hours. How much damage could somebody do in 7 hours or 7 minutes? So that's the challenge that we face. Today, we wanted to talk about some of these challenges, but we wanted to do something a little bit different. I've been to about 4 or 5 of these in the last 3 months, and they've all been very one-sided. People sit up here, they talk, they interact. People sit here, they don't engage, they go home. I wanted to try something a little bit different. I wanted to be an interactive and a learning session. It's not about us knowing everything. We do have experts that are here with us today, and I'll introduce them in a minute, but we've got a number of pre-submitted questions from people that have either attending or meant to attend and aren't here yet, that we want to share with you guys. But also we want questions from the audience of our panel. After the panel, we want to give our 2 sponsors an opportunity, two of our three sponsors, an opportunity to give you a little bit of information about their platforms and how they tackle some of these challenges. And again, the booths and everything else will be open post the information session for you to have a bit more food and interact more with a one-on-one. If we don't get through everything, there are complimentary cyber consultancy sessions sitting on your chairs, these things, where you can ask them one-on-one time and we can come out and talk to you guys. And some of our partners are offering the same opportunity. So if you do not finish your questions, by all means engage with us. So let me introduce the panel to you. We wanted, as I said, we wanted to be a little bit different. So rather than just boring names, we have our visionary, Nivi. So our first panelist is Nivi. She's regarded for her bright ideas and innovation. She is the head of cybersecurity governance and strategy at the University of New South Wales. She's a recent recipient of 3 industry awards, including the Australian Women in Security Award for Most Innovative Educator. Wow, did they fit all that on the trophy? Wow. For work with tangible uplift program being human resource capacity in the industry. So welcome, Nivi. Our second speaker is the one we like to call the builder, which is Enrico. Enrico, come on. Enrico is working at the coalface of cybersecurity. He is the CISO, I still haven't come to terms with that, at IMB Bank. He has an extensive record in creating and delivering roadmaps for uplifting organisations in their defence against cybercrime. Enrico comes from a strong software development background, infrastructure and security, and he's also very familiar with working with managed service providers in this space. So he'll be able to give us a different perspective on things. Our third panellist, our pragmatist, is Dr. Kevin Tam. Dr. Tam. So Kevin is our thinker and pragmatist in his approaches to solving cyber challenges. He recently joined Etika as their CISO. He's got 20 years of industry experience turning ideas into reality. With a background in academia, consulting background, and fintechs, he knows how to make the impossible possible. Big build-up to live up to. And then last but not least, we have the professor. So, our professor, otherwise known as the grandfather of cloud frameworks or the invention of the computer, has been around for a while. He comes from cyber risk management. David is now the cyber security practice lead at Avocado Consulting. He came across into Avocado as part of the acquisition of Cyber Risk Australia. He now heads up our cyber practice. So welcome, David. Anything you wanted to know about where it all started and how we got to where we are, David will know the answer. He's well recognised in the global community. He's also a journal author. So welcome, David. All right, we've got several topics to get through. As I said, we'll like to ask one question of the panel to keep it going. We do have some pre-submitted questions, but then the idea is to open it up to you guys to engage and ask those questions. We are going to try and keep the questions to the topic that we're on at that time, rather than jumping all over the place. So if you've got a great question on a different topic, just hang on for 2 minutes. We'll go from there. All right, David, over to you to kick it off.
Okay, good evening, everybody. So I wanted to kick it off by talking about 3 things, 3 V's, vigilance, visibility and value. And cyber resilience, digital trust, legislative compliance can only emerge after you focus on these 3 V's. So if you look at visibility, and there's no Y on the end of it. Okay. Visibility. So visibility means cutting through the overload of information to get complete and accurate and consistent picture of what's happening in your organisation. Who might be attacking you and why, and how well your control environment is able to protect you. Moving on to vigilance, the second V means working out ways to deal with the backlog of assessment work, the resource shortage you may feel, and also being able to simplify multiple frameworks or multiple compliance obligations, improve your processes so that you can demonstrate your duty of care. And the third V is value. Value means not just thinking about the next buzzword or product on a vendor-led roadmap, but applying some analytical rigour in quantifying your risk, prioritising your control uplift based on your return investment, so that you can then, down the bottom, improve your CEO and board engagement, gain trust with your stakeholders, have meaningful dialogue rather than abdication, secure your funding, and demonstrate value delivery. So tonight's panel and presentations will be focusing on these three Vs: visibility, vigilance, and value, and how they work together. So we have three sections on those three Vs. So our first section we wanted to talk about was the one about visibility. We're going to leave that up the whole time, are we? Yeah, okay. So visibility. So as I said, we're dealing with an extraordinarily complex environment. Alongside cyber threats themselves and the threat actors, the threat environment increasing, there's complexity in terms of increasing infrastructure and systems and the controls and tools that we need to manage those environments. And typically, we're seeing more and more that organisations that want to be digital leaders need to be agile. They need to be fast moving to compete, but they also need to protect their crown jewels and monitor their critical systems. So our first question is to Enrico. So Enrico, as our builder, you're probably the best placed to kick things off to discuss visibility. So in talking to clients, talking to our clients, there seems to be an overload of compliance activities. There's multiple frameworks people need to be assessing against. There's an overload of information and people don't have time to innovate. So maybe asking you, Enrico, what strategies are you employing to cut through that volume of data, the overload of information, so that it can get a wider coverage and visibility?
Yeah, so, David, like as you said, there's a lot of information coming through from multiple sources, multiple systems. And I think, the important is there's many lenses that we can put on top. One of those is, there's a lot of talking about having actionable insight and actionable information. So being able to reduce that noise and make it relevant to your business and your organization. So, for example, in my previous experience working with a managed security service provider, it was really important to build that business knowledge in the partner because that way they could filter through the noise on our behalf, and then the information that came through was actually actionable and was relevant to our environment. That way we could have the people in my team working on high payoff activities, putting value back to the business. At the same time, you talked about crown jewels. Everyone talks about that one, but there's a next level down. Like crown jewels are very important, but there's this much more. Like we are exposed to a lot of threats, and sensitivity and criticality of the data is very important as well. So having a good asset management system, therefore, lets you understand what you have to protect, not just the crown jewels, but a much wider aspect, and then you can prioritize the work that you do in protecting those highest sensitivity and criticality assets. Anything else that we could add to it would be around, what could we say? I think those two lenses are important. At the same time, talking about systems, having a single pane of glass or having a SIEM, for example, that does most of the groundwork and correlates a lot of those events. Most of the noise comes from having multiple sources coming at a security team from all directions, and takes time, sometimes hours, to find out that one event was related to another alert coming from a different system, your firewalls versus your Active Directory logs. So having a good SIEM that correlates those events and gives you that single view of an incident is very important at the same time to cut through the noise and have good visibility on what is happening for real on your environment.
Right, thank you. So this is the exciting part now where we get some questions from the audience. So we actually had a number of questions sent in. I think we asked everybody to send questions or some people to send questions beforehand. So we actually do have a question from the New South Wales Government. So a question to Enrico: how can we get visibility and impact in real time?
Yeah, so generally to have visibility and impact in real time, we would start from a framework, whatever that is, and then have some risk-based approach, and then have some KRIs applied to our assets. So when there is an incident, linking that instance to your KRIs is very important because that way you can see straight away the impact that it would have on your assets that you're trying to protect. So that would be my approach in terms of having that direct link between KRIs and your assets.
Okay. We have another pre-submitted question. So this one question from the audience pre-submitted is: how do you link policy compliance with compliance to other standards and regulations like critical infrastructure? So that's a question for Kevin.
That's always an interesting one, and I think what you're going to hear from the three of us is going to be similar thing, but said in a very different lens. And now I will actually go back to the whole information security management system, the ISMS. I know the ISMS is something that, unless you've actually gone through 27,000 certification, it's probably the only time you actually come across it. But the reality is that it's actually a framework that's fantastic to employ or deploy within your organization to do that. And that basically allows you to put in and identify what your risks are, how you're going to be defining what your key controls and your control objectives are, and then what the outcome are in terms of what controls you have deployed within your organization, which then also allows you to do your dashboarding. But to the point about how do you pull your policy against your compliance is that policies and compliance are basically a byproduct of an ISMS. And a lot of times in my line of work, I get asked a lot of times, how do you become CPS 234 compliant? Because I'm in financial services, right? My answer is, well, to be completely honest, I'm just going to do what's right for on my ISMS. One of the byproduct is literally the compliance. And it's something that I've spoken to the regulators many times already. Obviously, it's always an interesting education process with them, but it is one of those things, right? Once you can link what your risks are, your threats are to your environment, understanding how you define what your controls are, that automatically pulls out what are the policies you need. But at the same time, you can actually then say, well, this is how I'm going to meet the requirements from a compliance perspective as well.
I got a question for you, Kevin, about just around the asset side of it. So how do you sort of deal with that part of the critical infrastructure compliance?
Assets is always interesting, right? And I think different organizations will look at assets differently. And remember, there are two types of assets. You've got your physical compute assets, but don't forget information is also an asset. I think a lot of times we actually forget about that one, or we actually go back to the fact that, oh, that system handles that information, therefore that's, classified a certain way. So I think classification is important, but you actually need to understand, and I'm going to go back to terminologies like, your systems of record, systems of engagement, and systems of insight, and understanding what role your information plays within your ecosystem, and identify it that way as well.
Okay, now we've got another question from Matt in the audience. So Matt has asked, how do organisations work with complex environments, so how do organisations that are working with complex environments deal with the noise so that they can effectively operate their cyber governance processes? So that sounds like a question for Nivi.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So that's a very broad question because, like, I'm thinking about different streams of models and approaches. So it all starts with asset inventory, right? So you need to be able to, on an ongoing basis, have a process to discover your assets that are being introduced into the environment and make sure you have that process or a guardrail so that you minimize that risk to a residual risk that is within your appetite. So appetite could be like simply defined, doesn't have to be defined in a dollar value, but you can gauge what your appetite might be based on your cyber insurance at the least. So from that perspective, in terms of setting up a program of work to manage the assets, you need to first categorize or classify those assets into high, medium, and low cyber risk. And how you do that and develop that criteria depends upon the nature of your business. So you need to first understand what is the nature of your business. Does it allow you to apply more restrictive or preventative controls, or does it not allow you? So I come from an education sector background, and it is completely opposite. So we have to innovate, and we have to depend on attacks to realize, and then being able to remediate them or respond to them using endpoint detection and response or those kind of capabilities that can automate the response. So we rely on the NIST pillars of respond and recover more, but then you have to have a clear lens on the detect. That's where it starts to become more and more complicated, because now you're talking about visibility of the environment, and every day there are new assets that are being introduced. It becomes even more complex how hybrid your environments are. So are you like completely built from scratch in the cloud, or do you have legacy environments in the data center? It's a mix, all talk to each other, and then there are SaaS applications as well. So that is the approach, but we will slowly talk about it on how to manage this thing from a policy perspective. The other lens is the top-down approach, where you're identifying what the motivation of the threat actors are based on what is that asset in terms of information, and what is the impact that you're worried about. What is the risk? Is it just this operational disruption through ransomware and data breach and reputational damage? And what are the impacts, like dollar value impacts, regulatory fines, brand damage? And David touched on the point which is very important, which is being able to do a quantitative or qualitative analysis, risk assessment of those assets that you have identified as your most critical assets through threat scenarios that are based on MITRE ATT&CK frameworks. These are like standard known frameworks, repeatable frameworks that you can use, and then understand what is the total loss impact value in dollar value, and identify what the controls for each of those threats are. Only then you will be able to identify what are those controls that appear in each of those line items which you can prioritize. And then you will start to, kind of be able to lift up that. You can't scale at that level in terms of resources and time and budget. So you really have to focus on your crown jewels, like you said, but also have to focus from that perspective of what are your key controls that you need to not only implement, but mature.
Okay, thank you, Nivi. So I think we've talked about the linkages to the ISMS. We've talked about prioritisation and taking a risk-based approach, but I actually have a question around Gerardo's comment. So I think Gerardo was talking about the ozone layer and taking 7 years to find out, or to have 7 years of data and then work out based on that 7 years data it took another 7 years to work out that there was a problem. So maybe somebody could talk about, or one of the speakers could talk about how you move up that maturity level. So how do you move up that maturity curve from just dealing with alerts to dealing with threats and then prioritising those and only looking at the high value threats?
Oh, I'll give it a try on that one, right? And there's a bit of a journey, so stick with me. You know how when we started to move into the cloud environments, and one of the big key call-outs in the beginning stages was that, oh, we're going to lose visibility within the infrastructure. How funny that is, actually. It's actually the complete opposite. Anything in the cloud, you get so much information, you actually don't know what to do with it. And it's definitely the case in this case where you actually end up having a lot of events, right? And you actually deal with a lot of alerts. Then it goes into the next evolution of, okay, now my security operations center will be dealing with all these alerts. And then you realize that you're going to get about, I don't know, 50 alerts a day, of which you can't even deal with it. And it becomes a bit of an interesting situation where, you know, you basically have a SOC that tells you have a lot of issues, but you actually have no way of trying to get ahead of it. And that's a pain. I think I see smiling faces only because that's the reality of what we all face. And the interesting thing sometimes is you got to really ask yourself, what are you really looking for, right? And a lot of times, it's very easy in the early stages to create a sort of a security event. For example, unsuccessful logins. Great. Sounds great theoretically. And then you realize that it actually includes the people who actually hit their password wrong as well, right? You have to start thinking and maturing your thinking about what are the actual events that you really need, right? Moving from unsuccessful logins to 8 unsuccessful login and then a successful login. Or 8 unsuccessful login, 1 successful login, and then you start interacting with particular services, a privileged service. This is where you actually need to start looking into what your events are actually telling you. And it goes not only just from an operations perspective, it goes into your board reporting as well. All right, I'll talk about one metric that a lot of organizations have. How many vulnerabilities were closed for that month, right? Anybody who deals with vulnerability management knows you're going to have 25,000 you close this month, 15,000 last month. Here's the question I have for you. What does that tell you? It doesn't really tell you a lot, to be completely honest, right? However, if I turn it around and go, what was your exposure window on your crown jewels to high and critical vulnerabilities for that month? Is it 4 days, 10 days, 30 days? Now, what does that tell you now? So there is a bit of evolution of the way we think and the way we need to look at the data that we're collecting. Try not to go with just numbers, right? Make it meaningful. You have to actually sit and go, what does that actually mean for my organization? And I want to go add to Nivi's point as well, right? And give the challenge out there and go, you need to understand what your risks are in your organization. Then the question I have is, how many times have you read the financial reports of your organization? Right? As a security professional, I have to do that. Why? Because I need to know where the money is being made in the organization, how the organization makes the money. And when I know how the organization makes the money, then I know what the risks are. So it is that, it is a continual evolution from just dealing with the fundamental numbers, which is great in the beginning, as we start, it's great. But it needs to start evolving into what does that actually tell me in an organization.
Oh. Thanks, Kevin. So now we're open to any other questions from the audience. I think Amy's got a microphone.
Any question?
Thank you, Amy. Just related to pretty much everything that you guys have said. in a world where we're dealing with software containers that spin up in seconds, are there for minutes, might contain anything and then are gone, how do we apply a risk calculation around those? Given that they could contain anything, there could be vulnerabilities in there that we're unaware of. How do we actually calculate risk?
I'll do quickly and then I'll pass it on. So there's a lot of, so you're talking about transient infrastructure in the cloud. In transient, it could be like a Lambda function where it exists for 30 seconds, of which the risk for those kind of environments is slightly less because it's not really there in that sense. However, you do have no-touch production environments in the cloud where you basically put everything through your infrastructure as code. It basically spins up. No one actually touches the production. And you have to understand what vulnerability you have in there. So how do you deal with things like that is, you know, we talk about things like shift left, right? And I would like to say that, yes, you have to shift left. But what does that actually mean? You need to start allowing your engineers the ability to scan their infrastructure as code so that they understand what the issues are. Right? And so therefore they actually fix it on the spot rather than waiting for it to become a vulnerability, you know, and dealing with it as a vulnerability management sort of process. And that's probably the only way you can actually do it. It has to be automated. You know, there is no manual process for something like that. It needs to be. So what it means is your security controls, your scans and everything needs to start being part of that CI/CD pipeline. And you need to have controls. And I'm going to be controversial and say you need to be able to break the pipeline if it does not pass. Now, it's a give and take relationship with engineers. You promise them and go, if I'm going to break it, means that I'm not going to come up with a pen test for you to go fix it, right? So they see what the issue is, and therefore they're incentivized to fix it on the spot. And therefore, when you actually get to the pen testing side of things, you get to deal with the more exotic things. So there's a whole automation piece that you really need to look into, and then your traditional sort of scans and everything kicks in after that.
To that question, I think you were talking about the categorization of risk for that specific asset. So at like an information service level, it does not matter how it is broken down in terms of the design or architecture. If it is handling information that is sensitive to you and you care about, like I talked about operational disruption, you need to go back and think, lift it up one notch and think about, what am I worried about? Am I worried about the disruption of this service for my business? Or does it not matter for this specific service? It's not time sensitive. It does not have a return time objective of, say, less than 24 hours. So I'm not worried about that fact. Or it does not contain any sensitive data. For me, I'm not worried about that fact. And then apply the controls. So Kevin covered the end-to-end DevSecOps CI/CD pipeline assurance process. Yes, in that process, the one thing that I would like to add is we need to build in the policies so that when this vulnerability scan, any kind of scanning is happening, SAST, DAST, whatever you're doing, pen testing, code review, you cannot commit the code or release the code until you fix that vulnerability. However, you don't fix all the vulnerabilities. A good example is if you set a threshold or your appetite in the beginning when you're starting this process. Okay, anything that is 9.5 to 10 CVSS, I'm not going to tolerate that risk. You have to remediate it before you commit the code and it goes live, or before this container goes into production, for instance. So those kind of things, small fundamental tweaks really work very well, but you have to start from a very high threshold and then slowly with maturity move down towards more.
Okay, thanks, Nivi. I think we'll come back to some more questions in that topic. We'll have to move on in the interest of time on to the next topic. But there's time at the end for further questions on visibility. So I think we'll move on to the next topic of vigilance. So the challenge with vigilance is implementing specific cyber risk management processes and addressing that backlog of assurance work that everybody's got. And in many cases, that assurance work is actually a compliance objective for APRA or SOCI or a state government initiative. So there's also, as well as that, there's also a problem of cyber being seen as a roadblock. So many business leaders thinking and not being a business enabler. So, Nivi, can you sort of talk a bit about, briefly about your multiple frameworks and how, I know you've been working with multiple frameworks, you've been working on scaling processes, you're implementing a GRC. Can you tell us sort of is it realistic to actually manage this without a GRC?
No. So initially, when you do not have a GRC process, governance, risk and compliance process, governance comes with assurance. So you build a policy, you identify what kind of categorization of asset you're focusing on. But for each of those categorizations, you have a number of minimum viable or minimum defensible controls. So for example, you have 40 controls for your high risk, 20 for your medium risk, and low risk you don't pretty much care about because you've built your criteria such that you don't have to care about them. So you have like 5 basic controls in there. But then you will have to basically apply the governance around it. So there is a retrospective side of things when you join the organization or you have not actually embarked into that journey. And then there is the ongoing side of things. Once you've done the governance and identified the risk, it's all about risk management. So once you've identified the risk and you perform your controls assurance, initially I talked about trying to make an effort that in the first place you don't introduce the level of risk that inherently exists in that specific capability or solution, whatever you're building. You try to reduce that risk so that you have to manage less of it. Now, what we found when we initially embarked into that journey without a platform, it was inconsistent, not standard, not scalable, and you can't build enough decision trees without a platform. So in a GRC platform, some of the services that we provide, for instance, there's the high-level GRC platform where you're doing your threat modeling and you have all your threats in there, and you're like looking at a metrics perspective so that you can bring in situational awareness, but also decision-making. So you're constantly like kind of updating your threats. There were all these attacks in the Optus like breach and all that stuff. So immediately everybody realized, oh shit, API security. So, you know, then you bring it back into the picture. And like that is an uplift in your threat. Anything like a SOCI Act or something new regulatory act introduced, there is a change in your threat environment. So it will tell you how much your risk in terms of dollar value has changed, what kind of control maturity you need to uplift, and then show a picture to your management for them to make those decisions, you to get the budget and all that stuff. That is one element. Then you have project assessment, supply chain assessments, exemptions, pen testing, vulnerability scanning, and all those services that you can use a GRC platform to consistently deliver it to your user. The big thing about visibility is that if only the users or only the business owners come to you because they know about your service and the rest don't know about your service, then you're not being aware of the risk. If you're not aware of the risk, then you can't manage the risk in totality. So that visibility is pretty important, I think, and that is the GRC platform that I have, in my experience, found very valuable.
Oh, very good. Okay, so I don't think we've heard from Enrico for a while. So I think maybe following on from Kevin had spoken earlier about linking compliance and ISMSs. So maybe Enrico, you might have some ideas around compliance.
Yeah, I can probably add to that. And yeah, as you said before, you know, to Kevin's point, compliance should be just the natural outcome of you doing a great job and implementing a proper framework. But sometimes compliance shifts. As Nivi mentioned, there's a major incident, in the Australian market, all the regulators are trying to show that they're doing their part, and they introduce compliance. And that happens regularly over time. Sometimes they just get extended their scope, so the government decides that an industry is of particular interest, and therefore just sends one of their institutions to regulate that industry. My experience in PHI in the past, APRA has been regulated financial institutions for the last 12, 13 years, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, health insurance is actually quite relevant and quite similar to financial services, so let's just pretty much blanket the whole governance and compliance on top of private health insurance. So all of a sudden from 6 months to a year, we had to comply with the new standard, with a number of new standards in cybersecurity with CPS 234, and we just had to do with the people that we had. So that's where, having already a good framework in place sort of gave us the opportunity to just adapt and shift to be able to cover those compliance items, but the gaps that we identified weren't substantial because we were already quite mature in that space because we were using a strong framework that was NIST, but yeah, ISMS is pretty much the same, just different lens applied on top.
Okay. Actually, I'm going to answer a question now. So we've got a question from Jason. So Jason in the audience sent in a question, and Jason's asking, how do we ensure information security is kept up with a limited resources and budget? So I think my take on that was, it's like the golden triangle in project management, where you've got quality, schedule and budget. You're going to have to change one of them. So most organisations, what they do is they either do a basic tick and flick assessment. Shortcut the assessment, just get them out the door. That's one way of reducing the scope, reducing the quality. The second thing you could do is you can prioritise. You go only look at the top 10, 20% of systems, and hopefully that's enough to get you out of hot water. The third thing you can do is extend your time frame. Okay, let's do pen testing every 2 years or 18 months instead of every 12 months. Everyone's laughing about this because they're all doing it. Okay, and then the final thing you can do is, okay, let's try and get the money. Let's try and get the money because obviously the problem is the money. ROI. So what happens if you don't get the money? So if you don't get the money, you've got to work with the schedule again. So working with the schedule, how do you fix the schedule? How do you improve the productivity? So that's what Gartner's been talking about for 15 years and we haven't done it yet, which is working smarter with workflow. So start to look at workflow, start to look at machine learning to get your productivity boost. I think that's the answer for Jason. So we've got probably time for one more question in that vigilance space. Is there any sort of questions in the audience before we move on to value? Moving on. Yeah, I think we're running out of time. So our final topic is value, and I think a lot of people have already talked through this value, so it'd probably be a bit shorter a conversation. So yeah, ROI, we're right. So, but I think we should actually talk about the real ROI, not the risk of inaction. We should actually talk about how to get things funded, how to get things approved, how to understand the actual return on investment. And if nothing else, those recent events that have happened have really brought cyber to the forefront with boards. And the boards can play it in two ways. If you're in a board, you can do one of two things. You can say, don't understand it, it's an IT problem. You can abdicate back to IT. And 50% of people boards are going to do that. And then that leads you back to the second thing that could have happened. So you're going to have to go back and try and get the money again anyway. But the second thing could have happened, okay, they understand IT, they want to have a sensible conversation. So you need to explain or help them understand where to spend the money. You need to try and get the budget approved. You need to try and demonstrate value. You need to try and build a business case. So Kevin, as a pragmatist, I know you've got an interesting take on this. How have you sold non-tangibles to the board?
My interactions with a couple of boards now, it's always really interesting. And they always have a way of asking questions, right? Things like ROI, oh, I read this in Wall Street Journal, what does this actually mean? And it gets, you know, and it's fair enough. Now, there's also a limited amount of time that you get to speak to them. I would actually pull the card that you actually need to educate them a little bit more than that. And unfortunately, I am going to go back to the whole ISMS to actually, when you're actually reporting to them, you're actually going to be talking about the level 1 risks that you're dealing with, right? And hopefully, before that, you've already established the fact that, you know, cybersecurity has these 4 or 5, you know, level 1 risks, and talk to them about it. And basically, you know, always try to create a dashboard around those particular risks. Now, there's a reason why boards always ask about what your ROI is, mainly because they go, it's a technology problem, so therefore I put money into technology, I need to know what my return on investment is, without really understanding what it actually means if we don't do it. So that's where the education comes in, and you go, look, you've got these 5 risks, you agree to it, right? And this particular risk is starting to erode over time, or we need to mature it, whatever else it is. And that's where, you know, you can actually do that traceability within your risk into your control objectives, which is actually part of your ISMS, to then go, I need to improve this because it impacts this, which then impacts your actual risk itself. So there is a bit of a journey to actually get them across the line going, well, okay, maybe you shouldn't be asking about what ROI is. Unfortunately, you can never stop that because a lot of boards are filled with people who understand accounting. But it is a question of going, what does that actually mean? That's one part, and basically I call that a carrot. The stick part is, you know, the Privacy Act is amending, and, you know, fines are getting bigger as well. And that becomes an easy risk that you can put on a lot of board papers now. Risk of regulatory fine is going to get bigger. So that's another, but that's the stick approach.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. So I think there's another question for Enrico. So the question for Enrico was from the audience was, how do you get the board to buy into a higher cost associated with an MSSP?
Yeah, so I think, you know, I've dealt with one before. I'm dealing with one now in my role. I'm a strong believer, you need 24/7 coverage, and you can't achieve 24/7 coverage with, in my opinion, less than 16 people, counting annual leave, sick leave, etc. So if you can't afford 16 FTEs just to look after your SOC, you have to outsource it. 16 people is pretty, like, we can debate on a couple of FTE if you've got like a high-performing team, but you also need time for training, you need turnover. So taking all of that into account, 16 people, it's very easy once you put it into that perspective to then justify the higher cost of an MSSP because they have economies of scale, where instead businesses, unless you are a CBA who's got, you know, 400 staff in their security team, you don't have those economies of scale. So it's as simple as that. So I had those conversations in the past, and yeah, once then it just doesn't fly at the first meeting, but then that's gonna trigger the minds, and they're gonna think, and then they're gonna go around and visit conferences, and your boards are gonna ask other colleagues, and they'll go, oh, how many people do you have in the security team? And everyone's gonna go, I don't have a security team, we outsource it because we can't afford 16 people. So that's my take on that one.
Okay, thank you, Enrico. So I guess we need to now talk about the numbers. So in fact, Chris in the audience sent through a question. So Chris's question was, how do businesses best overcome the challenges of cybersecurity teams speaking one language and the senior executive management speaking another language? So maybe Nivi. So sort of a...
Well, this goes back to the financial language is something that they understand clearly. So goes back to my initial point on when you choose between qualitative, subjective threat and risk assessment as opposed to a quantitative threat and risk assessment. The quantitative threat and risk assessment is more likely to fly because you're giving them like a dollar value. They do understand it. So suppose your cumulative impact loss value if realized is $200 million, and you ask them a question, and you've made the effort to actually identify all the controls and then do a bottom-up budget of how much that will cost in terms of technology, people, process, resources, people and non-people cost, and you give both of them, both of that, to instill that trust within the board that, okay, if you wait for this to realize, and this is the threat landscape and the environment, and this is all of your threats that can materialize, if cumulatively materialize, it's like $200 million, are you happy to wait for it? Or I have a plan with my budget, which would cost me $30 million. If you give me $30 million, I can buy down that risk up to $50 million or $20 million. It's most likely to fly. So that is just my advice.
Okay. So we've actually got a question sent in by Margaret. I'm not sure Margaret is here, but anyway, Margaret sent through a question. How do you strike the balance between secure and accessible to provide a cost-effective and sustainable data security solution? So that's one I'm going to sort of take to answer. So I think that's the root cause behind the Optus breach. So I think my take on Optus was what we talked about earlier, digital leaders. So digital leaders, if you want to be agile, you want to be fast-moving, you want to compete, you want accessible, therefore you need accessible data. You need to have a large number of tactical systems. You need to try and work towards customer excellence, if you like. And to do that, you're going to have all of these tactical systems, and you're going to have difficulty identifying which ones have the PII, which ones have a huge backlog of assessment, which we all have, and you start to fly blind. So the answer to the question of how do you strike the balance between secure and accessible is those three V's again. The visibility, collating and prioritising your critical systems, mapping your data flows, improving your monitoring. And the second one, vigilance, your workflows, workflowing your internal engagements, automating your processes, innovating, partnering to improve and demonstrate their vigilance and duty of care. And the third one was value, demonstrating your analytic capability to be able to understand the risk in dollar terms, as Nivi said, prioritise, and make the money that you actually spent mean something to the business from a risk buy-down perspective. So the three V's are the answer to that question from Margaret. So is there any other sort of questions before we move on? So one more quick question from Trevor.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks, David. A question to the panel. I'm just curious your thoughts around, in particular, PII, obviously, Medibank, Optus, and thousands of others breaches. My question is more about, everyone seems to be talking about protecting the data, but my thoughts really around why are we storing so much of this data? Why are we constantly being asked for, I want to purchase something online, what's your birth date? And I'm like, well, why do you need my birth date when I'm just purchasing something? You've got my credit card details already. I mean, there's this constant need to provide this information. I'd like to see organisations looking at it going, well, firstly, do we need to keep this information? It's okay to validate 100 point of ID. There must be some mechanisms or ways to say, yep, we've seen this, we've got a licence, we've got a passport, we've got a Medibank card, whatever it is, and then acknowledging that it's been received, but not storing that data. I know I'm not hearing enough. I don't think, maybe it's just media, but the conversations around that. Why is it being asked? What are your thoughts? I'm curious about, what your thoughts are. Is that being discussed in your organisations? Is that something, a topic?
I think it's. I think it's people don't ask the right question. I think often the business will say, "I need that data. I need the data. I need the data," and it's there's no real reason or rhyme or reason behind it. And the ones that sort of we've been working with, sort of. You need the data, but you've got 10 years of data, and the next 20 years of data is sitting on an archive somewhere. Why isn't the 15, 20 years? You keep 2 years, and all of it should be on archive. They just haven't thought through that process, or tried to value the cost of having that data there. Because if you value it, you'll see that there's a tremendous difference in cost in your risk of keeping that data if you tried to quantify it. So I think that's the answer. So I think that's sort of, we need to move on to the vendor presentations. I'll call up Gerardo to do that.
Forced by the regulator. It's not a choice. For 7 years, we have to keep it for legal and compliance requirements, not because we want to.
In industry?
There are different, but the reality is that the bulk of those industries, and they keep collapsing them more and more. There's not many now that are left outside of that.
So you throw it all out on 7-year day one? I'd like to see that proven, 7 years and day one. All right. I'd like to thank our pragmatist, our visionary, our builder, and our professor for our session today. Thank you. Amy, I went to the CyberArk presentation the other day, and they said, oh, yeah, we were going to open it to questions, but we were worried it would run too late because it would run longer than predicted. And I said, no, you can manage that. Well, I've proven myself wrong because we're running late. So there you go. We have 3 wonderful sponsors and partners with us today. They're not just sponsors, they're partners. We've got the Splunk guys, the CyberArk guys, and the MyRisk guys. And what we like to do is let people know that that provides an end-to-end capability across cyber. The governance, risk and compliance capabilities of MyRisk monetizes that risk, which is a big differentiation. Lots of people can tell you there are risks out there, but so what? And if you want that board language, it's about monetizing that risk and being able to term it in terms that can create action. You've got the Gartner quadrant leaders in CyberArk and Splunk here today. Talk to them outside, and they're going to have a little presentation today to see how they meet some of these challenges. You're hearing all that noise. You need to filter the noise in order to be able to get above, keeping your nose above water. You can't do that manually. You have to use these world-class platforms and world-class solutions. So we're going to hear a little bit about how come I didn't get one of these cool photos? I just got one. We're going to hear from Nathan, and we're going to hear from Troy. So I don't know what Nathan's title is, Troy's title is. We're going to hear from Nathan. So I'd like to introduce Nathan Smith, who's the Regional Director of Security at Splunk. Hey, Nathan. So Splunk has 92 of the Fortune 100 as customers. Well, 8 to go and then done. Wow, very good. And as you've heard tonight, we do have a challenge in filtering that data, and I know that Nathan's going to talk a little bit about that and one of the big innovations that you guys have come up with in that space. So without any more waste.
Perfect, thank you very much. Very good. So as mentioned, so I look after the Splunk security business in Australia and New Zealand. So mainly focused on security operations centres. So we are quite a large organisation globally. In Australia, we're probably around about 250 staff, so a reasonable size in ANZ. As I said, my sole remit is security, so this presentation, unsurprisingly, is going to be a bit about security, a little bit about some of the things that we're seeing, and then we'll talk about how do we filter that noise, because ultimately that's probably our biggest challenge in security today, certainly from an operations point of view. So no great shock. Last couple of years have been interesting. Remote work, we all thought was the unattainable goal that we would have loved to do, but our work would never let us. We're now there. We probably now on the other end of that now. We would like people to come back, but people aren't. So we know now that remote work is pretty much going to be here to stay, certainly in the short to medium term. As a part of that change around COVID and people working remotely, digital transformation was on steroids the last 2 years. So we've seen people adopt cloud at a far greater rate. We've seen people look at moving to different types of as-a-service offerings that are built solely in cloud. We've seen our data move all over the place, where once it was in a nice single location, it's now everywhere. And our threat landscape, reality is it hasn't, well, it certainly has changed a little bit, but it's there, it's a constant. There's a lot of doom and gloom when we talk about security, but The reality is sometimes the fundamentals is what we need to look at, and we'll talk a little bit about that today as we go. So really, I like to sort of tie it back to probably 4 areas, and some of those areas where Splunk can help, and the other areas where it's not our business, but we've got partners, obviously like Avocado, that fill that gap really, really well. So we often at Splunk look at the challenges being visibility is our challenge. We have an extraordinarily large amount of data all over the place. I don't know too many organisations that know where their assets and all their assets are. I've never met anyone who could tell me that they know everything that's on their network. So visibility is a strong challenge for most organisations. We have a multitude of tools that are in place to try and, I guess, try and fill a lot of that challenge, and that in itself creates its own complexity. So having, I think the average organisation's got about 40 different security tools, which means you've got to have people and resources who understand those, or you need to outsource it to someone that knows those. So it's a lot of information stored in its own separate servers, its own separate application and data storage. So having somewhere central you can start to look at providing a lens across that becomes really, really critical. As mentioned, the attack surface has changed. Ultimately, we're seeing much more data now in not just one cloud, but multiple clouds. So I think the data was most organisations have 5 clouds in total or more, and that's on-prem in many of the hyperscalers that we've got, as well as other private providers. So it's out there in a lot of different places. So all that means that there's a lot more gaps to plug, ultimately, a lot more places to look at. And then our skills, I think one of our ongoing generational challenges we're going to have is the skill shortage that we have. It's very difficult to fill the gaps that we have now. It takes a long time to train up people out of university and get the on-the-job training and get the expertise that we need for a lot of these roles. And then we bring in tools that kind of supplement some of those learning areas. So it's a big challenge for us as we go forward, and it's going to continue to be a huge challenge as we go. Probably in the next 5 years, I think we'll see a real, probably a huge hockey stick on that piece. But once again, a really important factor of that is, and Enrique spoke about that before, around outsourcing and bringing in partners and helping you supplement that skill level is really, really important. You can't necessarily build it all on yourself unless you are a CBA or a Big Four. So looking towards the skilled resources that are out there in the marketplace who have the capability to deliver the services is really, really important. So one of the things that we're seeing, and it's now an industry buzzword, cyber resilience seems to be everywhere. I think zero trust kind of went by the way last year, and now cyber resilience seems to be the new buzzword. The reality is it means different things to many different people, but ultimately it's all about how do you try and have everything you need to try and respond to a particular attack. So I often sort of talk to my customers often around thinking of security as a service, right? So it is a critical business service in your business. So how do you now start to look at not just the indicators of compromise or the potential of being breached, but also look about how is that service running? What's the dependencies on that service? So if you are breached, what does that then mean to that application, or what does that mean to that infrastructure that you're running? So starting to think a much broader range of how that all fits together and trying to bring it into some sort of holistic message. And I think we've got a long way to go as an industry to get that right, but I think at least there is a much more focus on that now, which is good to see. So from a Splunk point of view, it's a few things where I think we start to differentiate ourselves in the market. So ultimately, Splunk was a data platform. We were created as a data platform. We were never actually a security company originally. All we really did was, in fact, all we still do at a fundamental core of our business is ask questions of data. That's what we're here to do. It just happens that sometimes those questions can be very security focused. And in fact, our customers taught us very early on that asking the right security questions actually gave them a really good outcome. And as a part of that, we built a whole practice around it in delivering a lot more outcome for our customers in building the capability of that. So at the fundamental core of it, we're a big data platform. We're providing you the visibility. We often use the word of that we're the Switzerland of the IT world, and that we have integrations with all the IT security vendors out there. we're not competing against them. Ultimately, we're there to provide you a single point of interface for an analyst to look and see what's happening in the environment and to try and make sense of it. And we put lots of smarts around doing that. And we'll talk a little bit about how we focus risk on that shortly. And then being able to then take that information and be able to form some sort of rapid response. So we start thinking about how do we investigate quicker, how do we detect quicker, how do we respond, how do we automate, how do we orchestrate as a part of that. And more importantly, how do we start to take a more broader reach in looking at working with different environments, whether it's on-prem or it's in the cloud. So one of the things that we looked at as a business was what makes up a fundamental SOC of the future. And there's a few core components to that. In the past, it used to be we just had a data platform that you ask questions of, and that's where we started. And then you start looking at, well, now how do we start putting smarts around the analytics that we run around that? Do we start to look at things like behaviour as a component to that? And then we thought about how do we now bring about providing automation and orchestration. All these things were brought about not by Splunk, but brought about by the industry trying to drive to an outcome which was reduce the noise. There was so much noise out there. And then we started to bring in things around intelligence management, bringing in more intelligence into the conversation, bringing in threat research, all these really important fundamental functions that you need in a business to try and make the right decision. And then on top of that, we looked at how do you then bring in the wider ecosystem, all the different vendors, allow them to start to provide information or at least provide a central point to getting the information to where it needs to be. So from Splunk's point of view, yes, we do tick off all of those things, but the reality is, from our point of view, it's all about how do we drive an ecosystem of partners, an ecosystem of technology partners to get an outcome, which is all about trying to get the information that you as a customer needs as quickly as possible so you can make a decision as quickly as possible. It's not necessarily the easiest job in the world, and I can't say we always get it right, but the reality is it's there to try and provide you the information that you need. So if we start to think about what does that mean? So in the past, a SIEM came about because we wanted to try and centrally manage everything and have your alerts in a place that you can look at it, and then the alerts became too much. And then we went, well, look, automation orchestration will solve that problem. And we brought that in to try and reduce the alert. But the reality is it hasn't fixed the problem. It still is an ongoing challenge for most of us. So what Splunk looked at from our point of view was if we start to think a little bit differently about how we pull together the information, and I think Dr. Kevin spoke about it before, around trying to correlate the different actions that are happening to make sense of it. So what Splunk looked at doing was rebuilding our whole algorithm around risk. So something that we drove around looking at focusing on a risk-based alerting approach, which was really about understanding the assets in your environment, understanding the importance of those assets in your environment, starting to put classification around those, and then more importantly, starting to look at things that might happen in chains. So if we think about the example of the passwords being denied, that's one tick in a chain. If we then start adding it into, now they do have access to something, and as Dr. Kevin said, now has access to maybe a privileged service. These are all steps in a chain that should be ultimately raising the profile of a particular alert. So when an analyst gets that, there's already a pretty good chance that there's a number of things happening to a particular asset or a profile that they should be looking at. And then, from that point of view, you'll start to sort of see, and what we've seen certainly in our customers is they've gone from having that sort of 100 and below alerts per day per analyst to getting 10 alerts a day for that analyst. So things they can now start to actually proactively work on rather than getting to the end of the day and going, well, I can't get to those other 40, I'm just going to have to either close them off or hand them to someone else tomorrow or do whatever it might be. So the whole point is just trying to bring that high fidelity to an alert or to a notable as quickly as possible. And then we talk about, great, so we've now found something that might be of interest. How do we respond to that? So then we start to think about, in the past, that would have been we incorporate a SOAR platform and we start to ask questions of it. And yes, that's still absolutely a very important piece to the puzzle. But we then start to think about using that in a context of a risk-based approach. So now starting to look at going, okay, of these different actions that have happened, are we running any form of checks and balance on those particular actions as they go? So when the analyst gets it, they've already got a pretty good idea as to whether those particular chain of events are starting to make sense or not. So a really important piece from our point of view is around trying to get the alerts to a point where when an analyst gets it, it's a high value of their time. It's not something that is going to potentially waste their time in a false positive, and there'll still be obviously a measure of that, because it's impossible, I think, to weed out everything, but ultimately they should be looking at things that are most likely going to be in need of their attention and probably a high risk to the business. And then we start to think about the other important bit from a value point of view is how do we then start to, beyond the speed of, speed to detection, speed to respond, speed to remediate, all those sorts of things, how do we start to bring that into a more holistic approach to the ecosystem? As I said before, the ecosystem is a really important piece for us. Splunk as a tool, we don't provide all of the checks and balances that our ecosystem provides. We provide a really good way of correlating that information and providing that information in a way that an analyst can understand. But ultimately, you still need that really integral part of the ecosystem out there to help deliver the information that we can use. And if we start looking at then tying that into industry frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK and those sorts of things, where you can start to actually pull all this information into some sense, then ultimately it'll give you a much better outcome. So from my point of view, I think I only had a short amount of time, so I know we're behind time as well, so I'm not going to keep people away. But from my point of view, the Splunk team are around. There's a few guys at the back. You'll see them in Splunk shirts as well. So feel free to come and ask any questions later on. I'm happy to answer questions at the end after Troy's finished as well. So from our point of view, thank you once again to Avocado for having us. It's a pleasure being here, and I think it's great to see so many people in an event like this. So thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Here we go. Okay, security. I'd like to introduce now Troy. So Troy is the engineering team lead at ANZ at CyberArk. Very good. There you go. Welcome. And you would have seen that a lot of the security the weakest part of the security chain is people. That's right. And people log in through identities and identity access management, privileged access management. The weakest part of the equation. These guys deal with it.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I start, I have a confession to make. I haven't actually passed with the team. I'm actually allergic to avocado. I had a small panic attack on the way over here that all the food was going to be avocado-based and I'd be doing this speech on a hungry tummy. But you can imagine my delight when I saw the spread that put on. So I want to say a big thank you to Avocado for putting this event on and such a great spread. I know Amy's done a ton of work to put it together. So, well, yeah. All right, I better move behind here now so I can actually know what my notes are. Similar to Nathan, it's a lot of the same sort of touch points that we're going to touch on, but we've seen dramatic change across the whole IT industry, let alone the cyber industry itself. It's no longer just one hacker or a one hacker group. There's teams. If we look at the things that we're seeing recently, you can go on dark webs now and buy access to organizations, whether sold by an insider threat or by an attacker who has gained some level of access into that organization. There's different compartmentalizations within these forums sitting on the dark web where, hey, I might be really good at exploitation, breaking into an environment, but maybe I'm not as good as monetizing that. So maybe I can have somebody else monetize that. Same sort of thing. I might be really good at monetizing, but not as good as the exploitation. So what we're seeing is these different attackers work together in order to gain access or get access to environments. We're also seeing a bit of a change in the way, from a media perspective, these little groups are now forming their own sort of social bonds and social networks, little cliques. You can go out and look up things like hack rap or fraud rap, where people like boast about their exploits, how they used cross-site exploitation in order to break into an environment. Or with fraud rap, that is really interesting. There's one big guy got busted in the States recently who was performing like COVID relief check fraud, made millions out of it, but then rapped and made a song about it, rapped about it, and subsequently got busted, which is quite interesting. But we see that it's seeping into pop culture now. It's becoming a lot more cemented in our day-to-day lives, in our worlds. Obviously, I just did something bad here. Obviously, oh, cool, thank you. Obviously, digital transformation has, COVID massively drove digital transformation. It was a big talking point prior to digital. COVID came along and really made that real. With digital transformation comes a lot more controls, a lot more visibility of data and things like that, but there also comes a lot more obscurity. I think this was really clearly put together like by the first Uber breach. Uber was probably a little bit further ahead than a lot of other organizations in moving to cloud and that side of things. And the first breach was really about basically where an attacker was able to get access to a bunch of PII sitting within an S3 bucket within Amazon. And the way they did it was they were able to compromise a web application firewall, an Amazon web application firewall, and pull out the credentials from that WAF. Now, normally, if those credentials were properly provisioned, as in restricted with least privilege just down to what they needed to do, that would have been useless. But the challenge was whoever set it up didn't understand that and over-privileged these credentials. So, the hacker was able to get access to a bunch of extra data. You can imagine that this is a challenge. Like, if we think about AWS alone, the entitlements, there's over 2,400 different entitlements. Even if I'm an expert in cloud and an expert in AWS, it's probably going to be impossible for me to know what those 2,400 different entitlements are, let alone when you start putting them together or matching them together to get an understanding of what does that actually mean. If we add these two entitlements, all of a sudden I'm a root user, how am I supposed to know that? So we've seen this real change over the years in the way that it happens. Oh, one second. Jump down. So from CyberArk's point of view, and I'll talk a little bit about CyberArk and what we do today, but really even though the industry's changed and these attack patterns have changed, the core way that attackers operate within an environment somewhat fundamentally stays the same. Essentially, does this have a laser pointer? No. Essentially, the way that we see it working is an attacker will gain... Ooh, no, go back one. Oh, no. Sorry, that one, thank you. The way that we see this working is an attacker will gain access to an environment. Now, this could be through, a phishing email or through, some sort of USB drop or just buying credentials off the dark web in order to gain sort of access. It's relatively trivial to make that initial step to gain some sort of foothold onto a user's machine. Now, it's very, very difficult for an attacker to go, okay, I want to attack your PII directly. It's much more likely that they're going to gain access to a user's machine and then from there use that as a jumping off point or a pivot point to move deeper and throughout that environment. So there's a few different ways they can do that. A user can exploit their way through, an attacker can exploit their way through an environment, essentially scanning the different infrastructure, trying to find out what's vulnerable, using that and moving through. The challenge with this from an attacker point of view is it's very, very noisy. If you've got any tools, if you've got any IPS, antivirus, endpoint protection, it's going to be very clear that something unusual is happening. So hackers have moved to this concept of living off the land, working with the tools that they have there on operating systems or within systems in order to use those to move deeper within environments. So we typically see that one of the easiest things they can do is if they can find your account, your privileged account, or an artifact of your privileged account that they can use to move deeper into that environment, that's an easy way to do it. So we see this loop go multiple times. They'll escalate privileges, they'll find new access, they'll use that access to move again and around and around and around until ultimately they get to what they need to get to and away they go. This introduces a really interesting concept of dwell time. In APJ, the dwell time for an attacker sitting within a network, in a larger network, we're talking about 365 days, about a year that an attacker will sit in that network before actually performing performing their final end goal, the keys to the kingdom side of things. So it's, I think when we're thinking about protecting our network, whether it be a huge bank or a tiny organization, we really want to think with that assume breach mentality in mind. If we're working from that base, we're looking at everything through a different light, and it's going to give us a much better understanding of how we go on and protect ourselves. So from CyberArk, obviously CyberArk is an identity security vendor, and really we find that one of the main ways to solve this sort of problem is identity. If we were here like 4 years ago, I've been at CyberArk for 7 years and around the IT security industry for about 20. But if we were here like 4 years ago, I'd very much be talking about privileged access, and privileged access being your domain admins, your Unix admins, all these people doing very technical jobs, accessing technical systems. That rapidly changed, not just because of COVID, but because of digital transformation in general, where different people within an organization can be considered privileged or having privileged access at different points throughout their day. It can be, yes, it could be that it can still be the domain admin and things like that, but it could be the person in marketing who has access to the Twitter account. Matthew actually uses a really good example. One of my colleagues here, Matthew, he uses a really good example is like where if I get access to a Twitter account, you might think, well, what does that really matter? They might, tweet some silly stuff or something like that. But then imagine it's some like sort of water corporation, and then the tweet goes out that the water's been poisoned or something like that, and you get an event similar like with toilet paper and COVID, where everybody rushes out to the store and buys up all the bottled water, and we get this massive panic. So these sort of ephemeral things can really mean real world problems. Technology is often looked as the solution to these problems. I think because we are in IT or IT security, we all have that technology background. So often we look to technology as the solution as well. We go, okay, what's the problem? Is privileged access or whatever it might be? How do we solve it? We get a new technology and put that in place. But that's not, it really excludes probably more key points, which is process and people. If you haven't got the people and process to back up the technology, and I've seen it time and time again, you'll ultimately fail. You need to apply that almost before you start going down that technology route, that people and process side of things, to understand what do we need to do, and is what we're going to do actually going to be effective if we don't have that there. I'll jump on just in considering time. I wanted to touch really quickly on Zero Trust. Clearly I didn't get the memo about the updated keywords. So Zero Trust is actually, it's a huge framework, and there's lots of documentation and stuff around it, but I think it can still apply to, not of course the Googles of the world, but all the rest of us as well. The core tenets still very much apply to us. Whether it be continuous verification of understanding who is doing what with your environments at what point in time. There never should be a case where something happens in our environment and we can't attribute that back to someone or back to a machine or back to an identity in itself. The concept of limiting the blast radius, which ties well back into that concept of assuming breach. If we're assuming breach, we're naturally going to start limiting that blast radius, because we're going to be looking at our assets and at different things within our organization from the idea that it has been breached and something needs to be done about it. And finally, and this sort of really comes back to how do we do this in a speedy and expedited way, and that is automating the content and collection and also response of what happens throughout through our environment, particularly around a security insight. So that's all good and well, but it's not just one technology that we need to solve this. I'd love to stand here and tell you CyberArk solves all these problems, and you can walk away and just buy CyberArk and you'll be fine. But really, it's a team game. Security is a team game. You'll have multiple different technologies throughout your environment, and it's key that these different technologies work together in order for you to get the most benefit out of them. CyberArk we have what's called a C-cubed alliance, and we have a whole bunch of technology partners here that we work with in order to bring our customers the most value, not from just our solutions, but also the other solutions themselves. We have integrations in with Splunk. In fact, we've got like quite a symbiotic relationship with Splunk, where we are able to feed them data in order for them to do correlation and action on, but when we're also able to take data back out of them for us to perform actions on. Like a great example might be, we've mandated from an organization level that users performing privileged access should come through a privileged access management like CyberArk. So that then we can have a correlation within Splunk that basically says if they're seeing privileged access to another server outside of CyberArk, then that is an instant area for caution or concern, and that could be fed back to us. And a reaction from our side of things could be, well, let's go grab that account, automatically onboard it into CyberArk and start rotating it or managing it. So it's quite important to have these integrations. That was the main stuff I wanted to cover today. However, if there's any interest around privileged access or privileged access management, please scan the QR code. We're happy to do a privileged access management workshop or an identity security workshop with you guys where we can go through and look at the risks that you have. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.